You know that feeling when life happens automatically and you learn to accept the small things as if they were everything? Carolina felt it too. She was there, in the middle of the brightly lit room, listening to laughter, flashes of light, and toasts, until a phrase whispered in her ear changed everything. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a scandal. It was something small, but sharp enough to cut through years of silence and submission. This story begins where many end, in a seemingly ordinary moment, like a brother-in-law's wedding, a rented dress, uncomfortable heels, and a desire to be noticed. But instead of affection, Carolina received scorn, the kind of public humiliation that destroys without anyone noticing. The pain hidden behind a forced smile, the tears swallowed in the bathroom stall. If you've ever felt like you've lost your voice, that your efforts have been invisible, that you live in a house but no one sees you, this script is for you. It's about toxic relationships, emotional abuse disguised as routine, and about the courage to end a destructive cycle. But above all, it's about starting over. Here you'll understand how Carolina transformed pain into strength, how she emerged from emotional isolation to find alpha male support network, reclaim your freedom, and build a decent home. This isn't just another rant. It's an emotional manual for rebuilding, step by step. Now, take a deep breath, because what you're about to read isn't fiction. It's real life, and it could be the spark you need to start your own transformation. Her brother-in-law's wedding was supposed to be a celebration, a time of joy, laughter, and family photos. Carolina spent days preparing her dress and her hair, hoping to feel, even if only for one night, that she was still part of something beautiful. But it took one sentence from her husband, spoken as if he were commenting on the weather, for everything to come crashing down. "You're just the woman carrying my children." There was no irony, only coldness, a sentence that summed up years of emotional erasure. As the guests toasted the couple's love, Carolina absorbed the pain of rejection. That phrase didn't come alone. She carried the weight of evasive glances, absent caresses, and words she swallowed. It was as if he had taken off his mask and she had finally seen the man she was married to. Public humiliation. I didn't need an audience. The complicit silence of pain was enough for me. On the dance floor, she forced smiles and danced with her children, trying to appear normal. But inside, her heart screamed. How can someone who shares your life with you reduce you to a function? How can your partner become your emotional boss? The answer came in flashes of conviviality, the authoritarian tone, the disinterest disguised as tiredness, the eternal "talk to you later." It was all symptomatic of camouflaged emotional abuse. On the way home, every step of her heels echoed like a reminder. She was alone, even by his side. When he opened the door without expecting her, when he went to sleep without asking if she was okay, Carolina was sure this relationship was no longer a home. It was an emotional prison, and her brother-in-law's marriage, ironically, was the trigger that woke her up. And here's the crux of the matter. Sometimes, all it takes is a flash of wisdom, an off-script scene, to make us realize we're living on autopilot, that we've normalized disrespect in the name of peace. But that party, that phrase, that disdain, were the push Carolina needed, and the beginning of a long and painful but liberating journey. When the door closed behind her that night, Carolina felt something different. It wasn't just sadness, it was clarity. Alone at home, listening to the heavy silence that echoed in the rooms, she realized that the relationship hadn't erased her all at once. It had happened little by little. It had been with compliments that had turned into criticism, with caresses that had become distant, with conversations that had become monologues. There, in the shadows, stared emotional isolation, which was becoming normal. She walked through the halls of the house, looking at old portraits. In each photo, a version of herself smiling, dreaming, believing she was building a solid family. But what she had built was a sandcastle on empty promises. The phrase spoken at the party wasn't just an insult. It was the confirmation of everything she felt, but avoided admitting. And this recognition hurt like a deep cut. Carolina began to mentally review every moment she had silenced her desires, every time she had given in to avoid arguments, every decision she had made trying to preserve the us while losing the me. What she called love was perhaps just psychological manipulation disguised as association. She never wanted company. She wanted a shadow, an extension of her own will, dressed as a housewife. And the cruelest thing is that she believed she was a good wife. She accepted control as jealousy, coldness as tiredness, silence as a phase. How many women live like this? Accepting crumbs and calling them sustenance? Calling love what is a fear of loneliness. Carolina was tired. But now, for the first time, she was also aware. And awareness, sometimes, is more painful than ignorance. I still didn't know what I was going to do, but I did know I didn't want to live anymore. It wasn't about seeking affection anymore. It was about emotional release. It dawned on her. It was time to stop playing second fiddle in her own life. And there, in the silence of the early morning, a new Carolina began to be born. Still scared, yes, but with a spark that would soon become a fire. The next morning, with the sun shining through the crack in the curtain, Carolina felt the weight of reality. But with it came the memory, the one that time had erased. She remembered the first days with Renato. He was kind, attentive, almost poetic. He said things that made her believe in movie-like love. But little by little, that sweetness turned into control, and she didn't even notice. Because emotional abuse don't come with a slap in the face. Come with praise that turns into criticism, with affection that turns into demands. Renato began suggesting small changes, first in his way of dressing, then in the friends who weren't good for him, until he stopped going out. He stopped reading. He stopped studying. And that's how psychological manipulation. He took root. In the name of care, he undermined her freedom. The pregnancy, which could have been a moment of bonding, became an excuse to reinforce isolation. Now she was the mother of his children, and nothing more. For years, Carolina thought she was the problem, that she was too demanding, too sensitive, too dramatic. That's what he said. And she believed him. Do you see the pattern? This is how toxic relationships. They remained guilty. He never raised his voice, but his silence denoted contempt. He never directly forbade her, but he created an environment where she felt bad for wanting more. She began listing everything she'd left behind. The graduate school that had been postponed, the cooking class she'd never started, the trip with her friends that had been canceled, her dreams that had been postponed. And that's when the pain turned to anger. Because when we see what we've lost, we start wanting it back. Personal reconstruction, it begins when we name our losses. And Carolina finally named hers. This stage was filled with tears, yes, but also with writing. She began to jot down thoughts, memories, reflections. A notebook became a diary. The diary became a mirror. And the mirror revealed a woman who wanted to emerge from the shadows, who wanted to be more than the one who takes the children. She still didn't know how, but now she was sure of why. The first spark of change didn't spring from a grand plan. It came from a simple gesture, a coffee with Helena, her childhood friend, whom Carolina had unwittingly pushed away, thanks to Renato's recommendations. That reunion, almost by chance, rekindled something that had been extinguished for a long time. Helena's hug, her impartial gaze, her attentive listening, all of this brought her relief. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. She felt the power of a female support network. In the conversation, Helena didn't offer prefabricated advice. She simply listened. And sometimes that's what we need. To be heard without interruptions, without buts, without reproaches. Carolina shared about public humiliation, the silence at home, the constant pain of being invisible. And when she heard herself speak out loud, she realized how trapped she was. It was there that courage began to blossom, timidly, but alive. Carolina returned home with her head whirring. For the first time, she considered that maybe she wasn't wrong, that maybe she deserved better. It was that day that she began to investigate female empowerment. I read articles about emotional abuse, watched videos from psychologists who explained everything that was happening. In other homes, that is. But it was the same pain. Seeing that other women had already gone through the same thing and managed to move forward was a huge boost for her. She began making a list of small goals, tidying up her resume, reading a book a week, walking again. Yes, small steps. But every rebirth begins like this. The important thing is taking the first step. And hers was marked by a cup of coffee and a heartfelt conversation. And as if the universe were conspiring, that week her oldest son asked her, "Mom, are you happier?" That tore her apart. Because children feel. And she realized that motherhood could be a strength, not a prison. That childlike smile was the push she needed to break the cycle. And from that moment on, Carolina would never look back the same way. With her eyes wide open and her heart strengthened, Carolina began to quietly draw up a plan. Without fuss, without warning. She knew that psychological manipulation, it was subtle but persistent, and any sign of independence would cause Renato to further reinforce the siege. So the strategy was discreet. First, he got a remote job with Helena's help. Then, he started studying at night, saying he was rewatching TV shows. He kept small amounts of money in hidden envelopes, in recipe books that no one else would open. He cut down on his personal expenses and began building his own financial independence pain by pain. With every dollar she saved, she felt like she was getting a little piece of herself back. It wasn't just money, it was freedom in the form of a dollar bill. And that feeling fueled her determination, even on the days when fear hit her hardest. The decisive moment came one morning. Renato, irritated by a misplaced towel, uttered another of his cruel phrases. "That's why you'll never leave here. Nobody loves you." There it was. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a slap, but it was enough. Carolina took a deep breath, looked at her watch, and knew it was time. She picked up her children from school, stopped by Helena's house, and, with her suitcases already packed in the trunk, she left, without looking back. The walk to her friend's house was silent. The children noticed something different, but they didn't cry. It was as if they, too, felt it was a beginning. Carolina didn't have a complete plan, but she did have the most important thing: the decision. And when we decide with our hearts aligned with reason, the universe begins to open paths, even if they're made of stones. The escape wasn't easy. She still carried fear, insecurity, and doubts. But every night away from Renato reminded her that her freedom was real. And the Carolina who had once remained silent at a family celebration was now heard clearly. She was no longer the woman who carried the children, but the one who carried courage on her shoulders and hope in her arms. At Helena's house, Carolina found more than a refuge. She found air to breathe without fear. At first, it was strange to wake up without demands, without judgments, without disdainful looks. But little by little, her body began to understand that she was safe. In the makeshift room with her children, she rediscovered the value of silence, the kind that doesn't hurt, the kind that doesn't suffocate, the kind that welcomes. That was the beginning of her stage of personal reconstruction. The first few weeks were tough. The past kept knocking at the door of her memory. She cried in secret so as not to worry the children. But she also allowed herself to smile when she saw them playing freely. She gathered her strength and went back to studying, this time concentrating on one thing. Public tender at night, after everyone was asleep, I immersed myself in books. I knew the road was long, but each page was a bridge between fear and hope. Renato, of course, didn't accept this easily. He sent her messages, threatened her over custody of the children, and called her ungrateful. But Carolina was no longer alone. She had the support of a lawyer recommended by Helena, and it was with legal and emotional support that she faced the first hearings. With determination, with pain transformed into an argument, emotional justice began to be built, not only in the courtyard, but also within it. The routine was exhausting. Casual work in the morning, studies at night, children in the middle of it all, but there was peace. For the first time in years, she felt like all her efforts were for a meaningful future, no longer a cycle of emotional survival, but a life project, and that gave meaning even to the sleepless nights, to the fears that still resonated from time to time. Over time, Carolina began to take care of herself, little things, painting her nails, listening to music while cooking, writing in her diary. Simple things, but revolutionary for someone who had remained silent for so long. Redefinition of home, it started with herself. By understanding that her body, her voice, her story had value, and that rebuilding herself didn't mean forgetting, it meant choosing herself. The final hearing arrived. Carolina, wearing a borrowed blazer and a steady gaze, sat before the judge. On her other side, Renato, arrogant as ever. But something in him trembled, because she was no longer the woman who silently accepted everything. She was a determined mother, a rising professional, a woman who knew her rights. The judge, upon hearing the reports, didn't just see documents. She saw the truth. She saw the struggle. She saw emotional justice happening in real time. Carolina was granted custody of her children. And there, amid tears and strong hugs, she realized she had won not only in the law, but in her soul. The children would grow up free from the cycle, free from cruel words, from suffocating environments, from distorted models of affection. She had broken the pattern. She had chosen emotional health, and that decision was priceless. It was then, almost unexpectedly, that life brought Eduardo to her, a kind, calm-voiced law professor. He didn't impose anything. He simply listened, and he respected every silence, every emotional scar. Little by little, Carolina allowed herself to. A walk in the park, a conversation without judgment, a look without demands. She was rediscovering who she was, a respectful love, where there was no control, only association. At first, she hesitated. She thought maybe she no longer knew how to love, but with time and patience, she began to understand. The problem was never her. The problem was what she experienced with Renato. With Eduardo, she learned that affection doesn't hurt, that silence can be comforting, that being a woman isn't about being an extension of anyone else. It's about being whole, complete, enough. This new love didn't come to save her. It came to accompany her, and that made all the difference. Because Carolina had already rescued herself. She was already an independent woman. Eduardo accompanied her along the way, and that, after so much, was more than enough. It was healing. The news arrived by certified mail. A distant uncle had passed away and left a small inheritance. A modest amount, but it meant everything to Carolina. It was enough to pay the down payment on the apartment where she lived with her children, which until then had been rented. This was more than luck. It was fate. It was the universe responding to years of grief with a symbolic and very concrete gift: redefinition of home. Now he had a fixed address. With the money in hand and the paperwork in order, Carolina went to visit the property. She walked through each room, touched the walls, and imagined the paintings she would hang. It wasn't a mansion, but it was hers, a space she had earned with sweat, courage, and many tears. There, she could paint the walls freely. She could laugh out loud, cook with music, and dream with the windows open. It was the material symbol of her life, emotional release. As he signed the documents, he had a moment of deep silence. He remembered his brother-in-law's wedding, the cruel sentence, the escape with the suitcases, and he realized this story wasn't about defeat. It was about reconstruction. That apartment, which had once been a refuge, was now permanent home, an achievement that no one could take away. Not justice, not the past, not trauma. The children were delighted with the change. They chose the colors for their rooms and drew plans for their new home. And Carolina, observing that simple joy, was certain she had done the right thing. Motherhood, which had once been her emotional prison, was now her strength. She raised her children with freedom, mutual respect, and healthy love. A new cycle began, and this time with firm roots. There, in that chosen corner, Carolina planted not only furniture, but also memories. Every meal, every afternoon of reading, every nap on the couch brought her a reminder. She had won. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it was real. And now, she could begin writing new chapters, pen in hand. Years passed. The children grew up. Routines settled. Pain turned into memory, and memory into learning. Carolina was now a symbol in the neighborhood, the woman who started from scratch, who won without shouting, who cried in silence, but rose with dignity. Overcoming trauma, she became the driving force behind helping other women. She participated in conversation circles, support groups, and wrote short social media posts about starting over. She was no longer a survivor, but a guide. One afternoon, she found Renato standing in line at a pharmacy. He was alone, visibly dejected. When he saw her, he looked away, and she understood. He knew. He knew he'd lost, that he'd lost control, that the woman he'd scorned was now walking with a firm step. Carolina didn't feel anger. She felt peace. It was reunion with dignity, that kind of victory that doesn't need to be said, just felt. That day, she came home with a discreet smile. It wasn't about him. It was about her, about everything she'd built since she decided to break free. The apartment smelled of cake. The children, now teenagers, were on the couch, and Eduardo was making coffee. This was where real life happened, without glamour, but with truth, with a light affection, with the daily decision to stay. And the most beautiful thing, Carolina knew her story wasn't a fairy tale. It was real life, with its setbacks, its difficulties, its insecurities, but also with its evolution, its tenderness, and its strength. She didn't want anyone to see her as an unattainable heroine. She wanted to be seen as someone possible, as an inspiration, as someone who failed, fell, but got up and kept going. Today, she lives with less, but she feels more. She loves more carefully. She works with more purpose. And she sleeps peacefully, because true freedom lies not in what we achieve on the outside, but in what we rebuild on the inside. Carolina is living proof that even after the worst, it is possible to be reborn, whole. Have you ever wondered how many versions of yourself have been silenced throughout your life? How many dreams you've shelved in the name of peace? Carolina, like so many other women, learned through pain that accepting little never brings relief, only numbness. And numbness, over time, robs you of everything: your will, your voice, your vision of the future. But what this story shows is that even after so much public humiliation, from so much emotional isolation, it is possible to meet again. You don't have to wait for the wound to become a scar to start changing. Sometimes, the spark comes in a phrase, in a gesture, or in a tear you can no longer hold back. Rebuilding begins the moment you decide you deserve more. More respect, more peace, more life. And the good news, there's always time. Even if you've hit rock bottom, there's a ladder. And it starts with the first step. So, here's a question. What are you still tolerating in the name of a love that only hurts? What's stopping you from being the author of your own story? If this story inspired you, share it. If it moved you, comment. And if you want to continue hearing stories that heal and transform, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Because here, every voice counts, especially yours.